The road ahead of us is dangerous, with ominous signs of trouble ahead. As nations prepare for an apocalyptic confrontation, what can be done, and how should you prepare?
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Voice. I'm Jonathan Bernis, and thank you for joining us today. Well, the ancient lands of Iran, Syria, Egypt, and Israel are all at the forefront of today's headlines. But we don't have to rely on the news media to discover what will happen in the Middle East. That's because Scripture identifies many of today's events and spells out the future of these nations hundreds of years before it ever happened. Imagine that. Well, our guest today thoroughly studied end-time prophecy and wrote a unique, timely book about it called Revelation Road, Hope Beyond the Horizon. Please welcome back to Jewish Voice our friend Bill Salus. It's great to have you back.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pleasure.
Well, I was so intrigued last time you were on the program talking about a book you had written then called Israelstein. And I was telling you over lunch, I see it in many articles, quoted in many articles. But you've actually written a new book now, which I think is even more intriguing. You've blended together your research on the last days with a very well-written fictional book. How did you get the idea to tie the two together?
Well, actually it is. It's a unique reading experience. It combines both a novel and a biblical commentary that supports the novel. My goal for writing it was to be able to reach the broadest possible audience with this timely information because, Jonathan, I sincerely believe that humanity sits squarely in the center of the end times calendar. And my concern was there's all these Bible prophecies that are stage setting in the Middle East, like you mentioned on the intro, that are about to find fulfillment. And they're Psalm 83, which will then lead into probably Ezekiel 38. And these are just the bigger prophecies. So when they happen, they will happen, in my estimation, soon and sequentially, and each event building powerfully upon the other and having an adverse effect on the world and America specifically.
Do you find, Bill, that among those that teach about the end times, that are current on last days events, that Psalm 83 is coming more and more into focus?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Israelstein. That the central theme of that book that came out in the summer of 2008 was the Psalm 83 Arab-Israeli conflict. Not many people had been teaching on it or studied it up until that point in time. So now that it has come out and the scholarly community's had 3 years to digest it, they're all having to answer questions at prophecy conferences about what is Psalm 83. I would say the preponderance of the scholars are agreeing with my hypothesis that it's an imminent event, a prophecy, a prophetic war of epic biblical proportion that could happen at any given time. There's nothing that really stands in the way of it except for maybe a couple fragile peace treaties between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Israel.
And Iran is in the focus of world attention now. The whole Arab Spring, which we're in agreement is not really a victory for democracy. And I wanted to talk about the events that are taking place now in the Middle East and how this actually ties into end-time Bible prophecy written hundreds of years before Jesus was ever born, let alone hundreds of years before all this happened. And ask the question when we come back, are we the final generation? Will we witness the return of Jesus to this earth? There's much more with Bill Salus when we return. Stay with us.
The road ahead is dangerous. Hatred is on the rise, and the truth is obscured by blind ideology. As nations prepare for an ultimate battle, what can we do? How should you prepare? In his stunning book, Revelation Road, Hope Beyond the Horizon, Bill Salus takes you on an unforgettable journey of biblical proportions. Through this unique blend of fiction novel and nonfiction research, you'll discover which nations will soon attack Israel, how Israel will fiercely defend itself, why there will be more terrorist attacks in America, and how the Arab world will face ultimate destruction. Troubling events are quickly developing, but even with an Arab-Israeli apocalypse on the horizon, there is a silver lining of hope inside this growing cloud of global doom. As our way of saying thank you for your gift of $40 or more, we want to send you a copy of Bill Salus's riveting book, Revelation Road. Your gift will ensure that urgently needed medical care will reach hurting Jewish people in some of the most remote places on earth, and that they will hear the truth of Yeshua, the Messiah. Call now, and we'll include a copy of the DVD, Where Are We on God's Prophetic Timeline? Jonathan Burness and a unique group of experts tackle the tough questions surrounding our troubling times. In it, they reveal which events are fulfilling last days prophecy and which nation will likely produce the Antichrist. With these resources, you'll gain the clarity needed to navigate the road ahead. Call or click right now with your gift of $40 or more to receive your copies of Revelation Road and Where Are We on God's Prophetic Timeline. Your generosity will ensure that urgently needed medical care and the truth of Yeshua will free these Jewish people imprisoned by sickness and bring them life-changing hope. Don't wait. Call or click now.
Welcome back to Jewish Voice. I'm Jonathan Burness, and with me today is the author of this new book, and it's a riveting book. You need to get it, Revelation Road, Hope Beyond the Horizon. And Bill, before the break, I asked this question, which I want you to answer now. Do you believe that we are the final generation that will actually see the Lord return?
I do, Jonathan. I think that the evidence is quite abundant. You know, I, as many, believe that the super sign of the end times was the rebirth of the nation Israel in 1948. And here we sit 6 decades later, and Israel is facing the greatest existential threat in its history. The global financial crisis is threatening to provoke the world into a one-world order, out from which will come the Antichrist, a one-world leader. And we have a generation of youth growing up in these desperate times that is rapidly losing hope. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, because I do believe that the generation that Christ said will not pass until they see all the things he mentioned in the Olivet Discourse exist today.
Well, we live in exciting times. We live in challenging times, but we live in exciting times. I want to focus our attention for a while on the Middle East, because this is a hotbed of activity. And I want you to talk about what is being termed the Arab Spring, which I don't see as any sort of a victory for democracy. We have liberals, all the liberals saying this is a major breakthrough for democracy in places like Egypt, and now moving towards this in Syria and so on. How do you see it from a biblical perspective?
Well, I agree with where you're going with that. The liberal pundits, when the Arab Spring was taking place, would have us believe that it was the youth bulge being driven by the social networks of YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, getting a glimpse outside of the confines of 7th century Islam and state-censored media into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That all sounds wonderful. And they thought democracies would spring up in the Middle East, but that's not what's happening, is it? You look at Egypt right now. They've had 3 parliamentary elections, and 71% now of the parliament is strong advocates for Sharia law, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafist al-Noor Party, and they are pushing for Sharia law, a government, a constitution based upon Sharia law. In Daniel 2:21, it tells us it's the Lord that changes times and seasons and removes and raises kings and gives wisdom to the wise and understanding, knowledge to those with understanding. And what have we been seeing? We have seen Tunisia started with Ben Ali, who reigned over the Tunisians for 23 years. Then it was Mubarak, who reigned over them for 30 years. Then it was Gaddafi, who reigned over Libya for 42 years. And then it was Saleh, the president of Yemen, reigned over the Yemenites for 33 years. And you had bin Laden in May was assassinated. You had Anwar al-Awlaki. What we are seeing is the removal of these leaders, these Muslim, these Arab leaders. And every one of those countries and every one of those leaders we spoke about is an end times Bible prophecy. So the concern that I would think about is not what the liberal pundits are saying, but the seasons of change have come in the Middle East. And because these groups are involved in these end times Bible prophecies, and there's many of them, we can suspect that the predicted outcome will be more pro-Palestinianism and anti-Semitism, because all of those prophecies, Psalm 83, Ezekiel 38, Isaiah 17, and more, are prophecies that come against Israel to invade Israel for various reasons.
Iran is gaining great world attention now because they're nearing completion, very likely, of a nuclear weapon, which Ahmadinejad said will be used against Israel.
Absolutely. And he has said on numerous occasions he wants to wipe Israel off of the map. Their whole Islamic eschatology over there is they want to hasten an apocalyptic condition in the Middle East to hasten the return of Muhammad al-Mahdi, the 12th Imam, their Islamic Shiite Messiah. So they are totally fine with creating a warlike scenario over there. And Israel is facing a immunity zone that Iran is about to enter, where any attack from Israel on their nuclear sites would have little to nominal effect to help them to postpone that nuclear program or to destroy that nuclear program. And they're watching that very closely. That's driving their decision on when they will have to preempt a strike. And no longer are people asking what if they strike or how they might strike, but when will they strike? And I point out in Revelation Road that there's a prophecy that many people are not looking at in Jeremiah 49, verses 34 through 39, regarding Iran. Because when Jeremiah wrote, at the same time Ezekiel wrote, two contemporaries of each other, he wrote about an end times prophecy regarding modern day Iran, as did Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 38. Ezekiel spoke about Persia, but Jeremiah spoke about Elam. Modern day Iran today is comprised of Persia back then and Elam. And Jeremiah's prophecy, very fascinating, may have predicted a strike on its nuclear sites, because it says that the bow of Elam will be broken and Elam will be struck at the foremost of its might. Now, Jonathan, I've searched high and low through the scriptures, and I cannot find any historical fulfillment of this prophecy. If Jeremiah is talking about a prophecy regarding Iran in Elam, which is, by the way, where the Bushehr nuclear plant is today, which is loaded with Russian fuel rods, if it gets struck, it will create, most likely, a nuclear disaster.
We're talking about prophecies that are a couple thousand older, that are 27 to 3,000 years old, that are actually in detail predicting what's in our future.
And that is the essence of Bible prophecy. A loving God who wants to give us information that he deems is important for us to possess to equip our lives for the days in which we live. These are the days when you have your Bible open and your news on, so that you can find your bearing on the timeline and try to get any understanding of what's going on. If you don't believe in Jesus and follow Bible prophecy, I don't know how you could get by without the concerns about what's going on in this world, the natural disasters and the global financial crisis and all these types of things. So
I agree. What does the Bible forecast for Syria?
Well, Syria is the wild card and all this stuff, and the Bible has a plethora of information, prophetic information written about Syria. You know, presently Bashar Assad is following in the same fatalistic footsteps of his father Hafez Assad, who in 1982 killed 10,000 to 20,000 Syrians in the town called Hama. And Bashar Assad was a young 16 years old when he saw this happen. He is acting this out again in the city of Homs, the third largest city in Syria presently, which would be comparable in size to San Francisco. There's about 800,000 people in Homs. So when you're watching this revolution taking place in Syria, it's mainly centered right there, which happens to be where he sent to protect a lot of his arsenal, a bunch of his arsenal up in early 2011 into Homs, because it borders where Hezbollah is in Lebanon. And a lot of those missiles made their way over into Hezbollah. So Hezbollah's now got a lot of Syrian missiles. They've got Scud-Ds, the most advanced Scud missiles in the world, can carry chemical payloads into Israel, and they can go over 400 miles and hit within a 20-yard target. So it's a very dangerous situation for Israel, because I'll tell you why. Because around November, just before Muammar Gaddafi took a bullet to the head, but NATO's involvement in Libya had gotten the Libyan rebels to start to make gains on Muammar Gaddafi, and Assad said at that time, if NATO gets involved in the Syrian revolution, I will send missiles into Tel Aviv in 6 hours. And in the first 3 hours, we'll have Hezbollah send missiles into Tel Aviv, and they have the Scud-Ds, as does Syria, and they have chemicals. And in the last 3 hours, so you deal with 6 hours total, a specific plan to attack Israel, Iran will block off the Persian Gulf from any Western intervention, Western warships. A legitimate threat to Israel. And the problem with that is Israel's response, of course, was, well, then we'll have to attack Damascus. Now, now when they say that, you're dealing with Bible prophecies. You're dealing with Isaiah 17. Isaiah 17:1 says that the burden against Damascus will cease to be a city. It will be a ruinous heap.
It's so clear, isn't it?
Verse 9, it appears as though Israel is responsible for that out of self-defense. Verse 14, it says, at eventide you will see Damascus, and in the morning he is no more. And overnight destruction. Okay, so this is why it becomes very alarming. And then 200 years later, after Isaiah, Jeremiah writes about it, Damascus, and Jeremiah 49, verses 23 through 27 that you spoke about, and says Damascus is receiving bad news. There's trouble on the sea. It grows faint-hearted. The trouble on the sea, well, it just so happens to be the Mediterranean Sea has 3 Dolphin-class submarines with nuclear capabilities to launch a nuclear weapon into Syria. Psalm 83, written 3,000 years ago by the prophet, he's called a seer, he was involved with King David, he was his worship leader, predicts a all-out, climactic, including Arab-Israeli war that finds identity with those inner circle of Arab populations and countries that border the Jewish state today. Hezbollah, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the Palestinians, the Hamas, the Egyptians, the Saudi Arabians. They're involved and identified by their ancient names by Asaph. And it is a war that I believe is about to happen. And Israel will defeat that war because God will not allow the Jews to be defeated. He has made an unconditional promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they would have descendants forever. So Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, I point out in Revelation Road and in Israelistine, exists today, and there's numerous scriptures that show this, in fulfillment of Bible prophecy to defend the nation against this attack in Psalm 83.
Well, it's incredibly well researched, and I'm absolutely convinced, as I know you are, Bill, that God doesn't want us to be ignorant of the times we live in. The men of Issachar understood the times they lived in, and they were wise. And all of this has been preordained, is available for us to understand if we're willing to spend the time studying. And Revelation Road is a book that helps us to do that. Thank you so much,
Jonathan, thank
for
you
being
very much.
back on the program. Bill Salus, everybody. We have much more for you ahead, so be sure to stay with us. We'll be right back.
The road ahead is dangerous. Hatred is on the rise, and the truth is obscured by blind ideology. As nations prepare for an ultimate battle, what can we do? How should you prepare? In his stunning book, Revelation Road, Hope Beyond the Horizon, Bill Salus takes you on an unforgettable journey of biblical proportions. Through this unique blend of fiction novel and nonfiction research, you'll discover which nations will soon attack Israel, how Israel will fiercely defend itself, why there will be more terrorist attacks in America, and how the Arab world will face ultimate destruction. Troubling events are quickly developing, but even with an Arab-Israeli apocalypse on the horizon, there is a silver lining of hope inside this growing cloud of global doom. As our way of saying thank you for your gift of $40 or more, we want to send you a copy of Bill Salus's riveting book, Revelation Road. Your gift will ensure that urgently needed medical care will reach hurting Jewish people in some of the most remote places on earth, and that they will hear the truth of Yeshua, the Messiah. Call now, and we'll include a copy of the DVD, Where Are We on God's Prophetic Timeline? Jonathan Burness and a unique group of experts tackle the tough questions surrounding our troubling times. In it, they reveal which events are fulfilling last days prophecy and which nation will likely produce the Antichrist. With these resources, you'll gain the clarity needed to navigate the road ahead. Call or click right now with your gift of $40 or more to receive your copies of Revelation Road and Where Are We on God's Prophetic Timeline. Your generosity will ensure that urgently needed medical care and the truth of Yeshua will free these Jewish people imprisoned by sickness and bring them life-changing hope. Don't wait. Call or click now.
Where are we on God's prophetic timetable? The Bible is very clear about the events that will take place preceding the return of Jesus the Messiah to this earth. And this is really a very important issue, knowing the season we live in, knowing the signs of the last days, because we're called to be co-workers with the Holy Spirit in what I call the end-time wrap-up. We are in those days now. Now, how do we know that? Now, Daniel chapter 12 is absolutely amazing because it actually, in the Old Testament, in the prophet Daniel, talks about heaven and hell. Let's look at verse 2. It says, "Many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Friends, that's talking about heaven and hell. It's talking about those that have died, and depending on the decision that they've made in their life, they'll either be resurrected to everlasting life, eternity in the presence of God, or everlasting contempt. That's talking about separation from God, literally hell, complete and total darkness. But look at the verse that follows. Look with me now at verse 3. "And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever." But verse 4 specifically talks about the last days. "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end." Friends, that's talking about the end times, or the last days. And then we're told what things will be like on the earth when we reach that period of time. Look back at the verse with me. "Seal the book even to the end of the age, where many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." It's talking about travel. It's talking about the ability to travel to and fro and the great increase of knowledge. Friends, that is very clearly the time that we live in. The acceleration of knowledge, of technology, travel, where we've now gone to the moon. We're sending unmanned probes to Mars and beyond, where we can fly. I just flew to Johannesburg in 16 hours from Atlanta non-stop. We are living in this time that Daniel foresaw, the last days, the end times, where the prophecies have been sealed or shut off until now, the last days, and we're seeing the revelation of these prophecies with the increase of knowledge and of travel, supersonic travel. Now, one more that I want to share with you, I have limited time, that clearly points to the time we live in, is the restoration of the nation or state of Israel. 1948, when Jesus was asked by his disciples, when will these things happen? When will these events occur? We're told by the words of Yeshua himself in Matthew 24, verse 32, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When its branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, yet know that summer is near. So likewise, when you see these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." The fig tree is symbolic of the restoration of the state of Israel. 1948. Can a nation be born in one day? It happened just as the prophets foretold. Jesus also tells us in Luke 21, verse 24, that Jerusalem would be trodden down by the Gentiles, by the nations, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Friends, that came to pass in 1967. The great event of the Six-Day War was the restoration of the city, the ancient city of Jerusalem. June 1967, Jerusalem was no longer trodden down by the Gentiles when it came back under the control of the Jewish people, allowing the prophecy of Jesus to be fulfilled. "You will not see me again until you," those, as he looked over Jerusalem, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, are able to say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." In order for the last days to come about, in order for Jesus to return, Jerusalem and Israel